Yeah, no, it got nerfed. Azureblight has been the dominant set in PvE for AoE damage for who knows how long. With update 44, Azureblight's getting a pretty hefty nerf, but how bad is it actually? Short answer is, yeah, it got nerfed and it's probably pretty bad now. Long answer is, it might not always be worse than it was. To answer these questions, I made a pretty bad calculator to track the DPS difference between the two versions. Along with this, I waited until the last week of PTS to make this video because they kept changing the set. If they could stop doing that, that'd be amazing, but they actually made it better in the latest update, so I don't really care all that much. Some quick info about this calculator. To figure out the base skills coefficient of the new Azureblight, I had to guess a little bit. The guess was made by making a fresh character and seeing what the base damage of the set was on PTS, which is around 667 damage. All characters have 1000 weapons spell damage, and this is the only stat that affects Azureblight's damage besides CP, which I never used to make calculating some of the stuff a little bit easier. With this information, we can take the base damage of 667 and divide it by our weapon spell damage, and we get a result of 0.0667. Decimals in ESO have always been kind of hard to figure out because ESO rounds everything, and it's sometimes up, sometimes down, we don't know. There's no really good way to check, and it doesn't follow any logic, like if it's over halfway to the next number, it doesn't round up. If it's under, sometimes it rounds up all the way from 0.1 to the next round number. It makes no sense. The problem with this occurs as we get larger and larger numbers. The 0.0667 skill coefficient became farther and farther away from how accurate it should be. Where I ended up settling was around 0.066724. This was accurate to about a 10,000th to the next number, and when rounding the number was always correct. I really quickly want to go over some of the issues with my testing and spreadsheet because there are a couple of them. As of writing this script, I only have access to perfect rotations of each, meaning the old Azureblight on 5 targets would detonate on all 5 every half of a second. This is basically impossible for me to do solo, and along with this it means its damage is going to be a little bit higher than you would see normally. The other issue that stems from this perfect testing is the fact that in-game you will almost never get Azure to be 100% perfect. Sometimes it misses a tick and will do it a little bit later than it should. Sometimes it does it a little early. The game's a magically wonderful thing that just sometimes does things when it wants to. Along with this, the spreadsheet is only looking at infinitely long fights. The reason this is important is depending on fight length, the higher damaging Azure may change. The other major downside has to do with how I'm doing the uptimes. With this spreadsheet, since we're tracking an infinite fight, this means for this fight duration you have been keeping the certain uptimes you want the entire time. In a normal fight in ESO, enemies will end up on the ground or you'll have enemies walking in and out of cleave. This will dramatically change which Azureblight is better. With all that garbage out of the way, let's look at some data that I got. Azureblight got nerfed, but how badly it got nerfed heavily depends on the amount of enemies getting hit. Azureblight scaling was massively increased to the point where on PTS after 3 targets, new Azureblight actually hits harder per tick. The biggest problem with this new Azureblight actually comes from its new tick rate. Azure now only ticks every second instead of every half a second. This effectively means unless new Azureblight can ever per tick do double the damage of old Azureblight, you'll never see a DPS increase from the new one. In a perfect world where both Azures are going off as fast as they possibly can, the new Azure will never outdamage the old one. The first time that new Azure does become better is on 4 targets, with old Azure seeing around 20% uptimes. This is very unlikely to happen as 20% uptimes means you're just not dotting enemies. We can also look at when new Azure is closest to the old Azure. On average, when hitting 4 to 5 enemies, new Azure comes within a decent percentage of old Azure. This brings me to my last limitation of my testing. I was only ever testing new Azure versus old Azure, never the new Azure versus other sets. There could be other sets in the game that outperform this now, however, I'm just not sure. Looking at some other funny stuff with new Azure is it actually loses power compared to old Azure again after going above 5 targets. While at first this might not make sense, it actually does, as new Azure stops scaling at 5 targets while the old one scales all the way up to 7. We can also see, on average, this is taking from 100% uptime to 10% uptime, which I probably should have weighed it more towards the higher uptimes, as low uptimes on Azure is very hard to do because it's very easy to keep up. But on average, new Azure will never outperform old Azure. New Azure gets closest to old Azure at 5 targets and is around a 9% damage loss when compared to old Azureblight. Overall, did Azureblight get nerfed? Yes. Was it a terrible nerf that shot the set into the sun never to be seen from again? Honestly, I don't know. For me personally, I can't think of another set in the game that fits the role of what Azure was doing. This is the main reason though that I'm frustrated with the nerf, as in certain fights it might be a lot harder to clear them, there might be some issues with it, specifically looking at you Reef. One last thing before I end this video. I learned this a bit ago and never really had a good time to share it. If you didn't know, Azureblight is a single target direct damage proc, so AoE damage increases don't work on it. GG Zos, that makes as much sense as Arcanist Beam when it first got released, but honestly, at this point, nothing surprises me with this game. But I hope you enjoyed this video and got something useful out of it, and thanks for watching.